Okay, let's go back. Okay, so this Tzadi, sometimes called Tzaddik, 18th letter of the 22, numerical value is 90. These are the different forms. And we were talking about the final form, the 5 letters in the Hebrew alphabet, that when it's we don't have anything like that in English. So it's a weird concept for us, but these letters are called sofit. Sof is the Hebrew word that means end. So we have the chaf, this letter, and then the chaf sofit, this form. We have a mem that looks like that, and a mem sofit. We have a nun that looks like that, and a nun sofit. Pei that looks like that, and a pei sofit. And then we have this letter. This is the tzadi sofit. Okay, so this is what it looks like in print. In handwriting, it's completely different. Now, it is said that the tzadi, let's go back and look at this, looks like something like a bent nun, if you can follow the arrow, a bent nun with a yud sticking out of it. Can you see that? Sort of like a bent yud. I mean, I'm sorry, a bent nun, like a nun that's leaning over, okay? A nun that's leaning over with a yud over the top. So it's so there's an interpretation that the nun is related to the idea of ona'ah, which is deceit or fraud, and that it is something that people mistake, thinking that the physical world is the world of ultimate truth, of ultimate pleasure. And the yud comes in. The yud is the first letter of one of Hashem's sacred names that represents the ability to see things differently. And added to the nun, it teaches us this lesson that the material world is not what's the most important. It is actually the most transitory. It's not the source of goodness and joy. And so it's important to be focused on something that is truer and more divine than material pleasures. Interestingly enough, I happen to be reading this book. Some of you may remember this case. I don't know how much you were paying attention, but in the like around 2005, 2008, something like that, there was a huge case in the Jewish world in the US of a man named Shlomo Mordechai Rubashkin. And he was the operator of a huge plant, a kosher meat slaughtering plant in rural US, in Iowa, in a city called Postville, Iowa. And he got into a lot of trouble and he was sent to prison. And he came to our community in Efrat. He's out of prison now. He came to our community in Efrat and he spoke about the importance of focusing on eternal things. Like he was a religious man and he tried to maintain his religious status and his observance of Torah the whole time that he was in prison. And he doesn't even call it being in prison because he says that's like saying you're imprisoned. He says being in a place called prison. It's a really fascinating book because I have to say that I did not have the most positive impression of his guilt. But when you read his story, it totally changes the story. The point is that he understood, even though his body was imprisoned for a number of years, that what was happening around him wasn't as important as what was happening within him, what was happening in his spiritual world. And that is sort of one of the lessons of this letter. Okay, so as I usually do, here's 3 very common words that start with this letter. This word in Hebrew is tzaddik. A tzaddik is a righteous male individual. If you're speaking about a woman who is righteous, we call her a tzaddikah, or sometimes a tzaddiket or tzaddikis, depending on how you twang it. There are 2 very similar words. Tzedakah, also Tzadi Daled Kuf Hey, is charity, but it also means righteousness. And tzedek is also righteousness. Okay, so there you have, and as always, I will share this with you. But I'm going to just stop the share, and let's talk about what we want to talk about today. I used to be a lot more facile moving things around. when I was on my Windows machine. But um, over the last couple of weeks, we have done some really heavy stuff theologically, um, and give me a second. Let me just pull up this document for myself. Very heavy stuff, and sometimes things that were very hard, hard for me to teach, and maybe hard for some people to hear. And so today I want to go to something a little bit lighter. It is some traditional Torah commentary that tells a remarkable story of one of the most important personalities in Tanakh, in Hebrew scripture. So last week we learned about how how Moses was the greatest prophet that there could ever be. It was principle number 7. I'm just going to repeat it to you here. I believe with complete faith that the prophecy of Moses, our teacher, peace upon him, was true, and that he was the father of the prophets, both of those who preceded them and those who followed him. And the reason for that we talked about last week is because if the prophecy of Moshe, which included the giving of the Torah, could have been superseded, then that calls the entire Torah into question. And so we have to consider Moshe as being the like the prophet of all prophets. Also, we spoke about this, how his relationship with God was face to face, and that's very different than how other prophets receive prophecy. But we notice something incredibly interesting when we really examine the life of Moshe. We see this remarkable pattern. So I have a colleague whose name is Rabbi Nir Manusi, and he put out a notice about a workshop that he's involved in. He's on I don't even remember the exact topic, but there were some men presenting and some women presenting. And the flyer that he shared had pictures both of men and women that were presenting. And I wrote to him to congratulate him, because we happen to live in a time, I'm not very proud of this, and I think it's a big distortion and a mistake where this is going. But in the Jewish community, in the Orthodox Jewish community, there are some people who are pushing for the erasure of women's faces, names, in any kind of a public setting. And I have a whole talk about why I think that's the case. It's a big distortion in my opinion, but it is something that I have seen happen in our community, to my embarrassment. I say all that. In fact, there was just so there's some community in New Jersey that has like a local newsletter for the Orthodox community. And there was like an Ask the Rabbi column. And this woman said, I'm in a Zoom class that's mixed, that there's men and women. What do I do about leaving my camera on? Okay, so obviously, so her face could be seen. And it is disgusting to me to say this to you, but she was advised that it was proper in a mixed class to turn her camera off. I think this is a huge mistake. I believe it's a complete distortion of Torah. And why am I telling you all this? How does this relate to what I just said we were going to talk about Moshe? Because the pattern that we see over and over again in the life of Moshe is that women keep saving his life, women and girls. It happens multiple times. First, we have the Hebrew midwives. We have his mother, his sister, and his wife. And I want to go through these stories with you in a little bit more detail, okay? By starting all the way back in the book of Exodus, in the book of Shemot, chapter 1, verses 8 through 15. So here's what happens. The descendants of Jacob, the descendants of Yaakov, the tribes and all of their descendants are living in Egypt. They're living in a section of Egypt called Goshen, and the Pharaoh that I call Paro, that had a good relationship with Joseph, that he worked for, either died. There's two opinions. Either he died and a new guy came into power, or something happened and he completely forgot about all of the contributions that Joseph had made to Egypt. So the the text, if you look at Exodus chapter 1, starting with verse 8, that a new king comes into power who does not know Joseph. And this is where the trouble starts for the Israelites. And he says the Israelites are becoming very numerous, and we have to deal wisely with them. Otherwise, the concern is that they may fight, they may join the enemies of Egypt in some future war that doesn't exist and fight against the Egyptians. Okay, so Pharaoh issues a couple of decrees. The first one is harsh labor, and this is where the Israelites become pressed into slavery. But they continue to grow. The population continues to grow. How is that possible? Because our rabbis teach, and this is this unbelievable miracle on multiple levels, that the women in Egypt, when they got pregnant and had children, they routinely had like 6 children at a time. So the population grew unnaturally, um, because that's not normal in any like, any human potential. Okay, so Paro says, well, that's not working. So now in Egypt is a very it's a culture that has a lot of black magic and practitioners of black magic. And the practitioners of black magic tell Paro that there's going to be somebody who's going to redeem the Israelites from slavery, but he's going to meet his end in water. Okay. Now, it's a very vague kind of a pronouncement, but Paro decides that his second decree, when harsh labor isn't working, um, to issue a decree of infanticide. Okay, we're going to kill all the babies. Well, we're going to kill the Israelite baby boys. Now, in Exodus, Shemot, chapter 1, verse 15, the Paro speaks to what is called the Hebrew midwives, who the text calls Shifra and Pua. However, the rabbis say Shifra and Pua were actually Yocheved and Miriam. Yocheved is the name of the mother of Moses, and Miriam is, of course, his older sister. Now, Moses is not born yet at this point. Okay, so here's Paro saying that he's charging the Hebrew midwives with the responsibility to kill all the baby boys, as they're supposed to be there helping the mother help deliver them. Shifra, by the way, and Shifra is a fairly common name for Hebrew women today, Israeli women, whatever. The name means, it's spelled Shin Pei Resh He, Shifra. It's related to Mishaperet, which means to beautify. So she got that name because she cleaned up the blood in the afterbirth after delivery. That's why she was called Shifra. And Pua was called Pua because she used to coo to the newborn infants, like, like like you would with a newborn infant. Okay. But also Pua, who our rabbis say is Miriam, had a prophecy that her mother, Yocheved, also known as Shifra, was going to give birth to the person who was going to save the Israelite nation. Okay, that's one of the reasons why the rabbis say that Pua is Miriam, because of course we know that story, that is what Miriam did. Okay, so Paro gives them marching orders, and he says to them, when you go to deliver, I'm now in verse 1, chapter 16, chapter 1, verse 16. When you go to deliver the Hebrew women, they're in labor, you're going to go attend to them. You have to look carefully at the birth stool. And if the infant is a boy, you need to kill it. But if it's a girl, you can let it live. This is Paro's instructions. Okay. Now, the word for birth stool in Hebrew is avnayim, which is a plural word in Hebrew that literally means 2 stones or twin stones. Because in those days, apparently, women gave birth sitting up. And so the twin stones are either their legs or some device that they put their legs out on or something that would be held by the midwife. So that's one understanding. But Avnaim also refers to a miracle that God performed for the Israelite women when they were in childbirth, because normally multiple childbirth, like when you're delivering six babies at a time, would be very, very painful. But God made their bodies, according to this rabbinic understanding, as tough and insensitive to pain as stone. So they were able to, with relative physical ease, deliver these babies. Okay, so now the rabbis continue that Miriam, at this point, by the way, Miriam, aka Pua, is 5 years old. And she hears this decree of Paro's, and she takes him to task, and she tells him that he's a wicked king and God is going to punish you someday. And she just lets him have it. And Paro is recorded in our tradition as calling over the executioner with the intention of getting rid of Miriam, because she has spoken out of turn in a very, very difficult way. Now we know that Miriam does not die when she's 5 years old, because we know her life continues. So her mother, who's on the scene because she's the other midwife, convinces Paro that she's only 5. Why should you be angry with the words of a little girl? She doesn't know what she's saying. And Paro agrees to let her live. Okay. In his eyes, this plan is a good plan, because the midwives would be responsible for killing the children. So it's not even like the deaths of these infant babies is on his account. Okay, it's not even on his account, because he's not the one really killing them. And the reason he only cared about the males was because of this idea that the astrologer said that a son was destined to be born who would save the Israelites. Okay, so let's go on to verse 17. What did the midwives do? This, if you're familiar with the story, you know that they feared God and not Paro. And they did not do what Paro said that they should do, and they allowed the infant boys to live. Now, how did they get away with that? So look at the way the verse is, because if you pay close attention, even in English, you can see this. It would have been sufficient to say that the midwives did not do as the Egyptian king had ordered them, but then it also says they allowed the infant boys to live. Now, what does that mean? What does that add? If they didn't do what Pyro said, you hear the question? Shake your head. Yes, no, yes. Okay. If they didn't do what Pyro said, then obviously the infant boys are going to live. But not only, according to our tradition, did they not kill them, they also did whatever they could do to help. So, for example, our tradition says that they prayed that each child should be born healthy, because if the child was born handicapped in some way, that the Israelite women might suspect that the midwives had done something that, like as the baby's coming out, damaged them in some way. They also prayed that the mothers not die in childbirth. Remember, this is ancient Egypt, so that was not an uncommon thing, because they didn't want to be blamed for their deaths. Okay, so in those more spiritual ways, they really did grant life to Hebrew children, but also they did charitable acts, what we called tzedakah or tzedek, that if it was a poor family, they arranged for them to have food, they arranged for them to have the clothing that they need, or diapers, or whatever you would use for a newborn infant in ancient Egypt. So they went above and beyond. They didn't just not kill them, they did everything that they could to improve the circumstances. Remember, we're talking about, now Moses is not born yet, but we're talking about the mother and the sister of Moses. Now, in verse 18, Paro figures out that they are not doing what he told them to do, and he calls them and he says, "Why are you doing this?" And they have a couple of answers. One of their answers is, we see in verse 19, they say that the Hebrew women are different than the Egyptian women, because they know they can handle like the rigors of childbirth, and they often give birth before we can even get there. And it's much easier to kill a baby as it's coming out than once it's already born and the mother already knows it's a viable baby, right? That's harder to get away with. So one excuse they give them is we didn't disobey your orders. It's just that they're not calling us until the baby's already born. That's one answer they give. Another answer they give, and for this you need the Hebrew, so I'm gonna tell you that they refer to the Hebrew women, ha'ivriot, the Hebrew women, kechayot, are like animals. What does that mean? Like animals don't require midwives to give birth. And it's so clever because they're playing into the prejudice that Paro and the Egyptians have that the Hebrews, that the Israelites are something less than fully human, right? In that language, which again, you can only access through the Hebrew. But they also have another explanation for Paro. And they say, the Israelites are not stupid, that they were fully aware that you called us and gave us this order, and they knew that you wanted us to harm or kill the newborns. And since they were able to do without us, um, they stopped calling us. They said, but this is such a lie, but it's so smart. They said, we realized that providing food or clothing or whatever for the newborns made us look suspicious, but we didn't do it because we love these newborn children. They are lying through their teeth to Paro. They did it because they wanted to gain a reputation, they said, for providing food for the poor families, so that this would provide a rationale, a justification for the birthing women to call them in. And then they would be able to be present at the birth and do what he's asking. You see, it's what we call a Yiddish cup, a Yiddish cup. Like it's such a like clever way of them twisting the reality. Okay, so there's a tradition. If you let's just skip to verse 21, that the midwives never actually killed any of these babies because the midwives feared God and God rewarded them. He made them houses. That's one translation. They also received eternal reward because Miriam, much later in her life, she marries Kalev, who you may know as Caleb, who was from the tribe of Yehuda, from the tribe of Judah. And thus, the tribe of Judah, what does that say to you? The tribe of Yehuda is the tribe from which the royal dynasty of David and ultimately Mashiach is destined to come. So Miriam, as one of the rewards, is that she's part of that line. Yocheved, who's the mother, become the mother of Moshe. Also, she has another son. So there's Miriam's born first. There's Aaron, okay, he's the older brother of Moshe. Aaron becomes the first Kohen Gadol, the first high priest, okay, and Moshe himself is obviously a very important person. So Yocheved, her three children are all leaders in the Israelite society. And that's a big reward. That's a big merit for a mother. There's a third decree. So we talked about harsh labor, we talked about infanticide, and now we're up to the third decree, throwing boys into the Nile. Okay, so now we're in verse 22. Paro then gives orders to all of his people. Every boy who is born must be cast into the Nile, but every girl shall be allowed to live. Okay, now he's not just talking to the Hebrew midwives, he's talking to the entirety of the people to participate in the execution of his plan. He needs all of the Egyptians also to throw their baby boys into the Nile. So now we're going to get to Yocheved next, but now Moses is born, okay? And on the day that he's born, the astrologers, the ones that are advising Paro, they can see, however, they can see through black magic, whatever, they can see that the one who's going to save this nation from Egypt has been born. But they said we can't tell if he's Egyptian or if he's an Israelite, but we can tell that he will ultimately come to his end through water. Okay, so what they didn't know, and you know because you've read this, is that Moses eventually suffers through water. He doesn't die in water, but because of the whole sin with striking the rock instead of speaking to it, he is prevented from entering the land of Israel. And that's so there you understand that the prophets in Egypt were they got a transmission, but like it wasn't so clear. It wasn't anything like when God spoke to Moses, panim al panim, face to face. Okay. So they have some of the information, but they don't have all of it. Now, let's turn to Yocheved, who is, and her story, because Moses is now born. Okay, but we have to go back to where we meet Yocheved first. So now we're in Shemot, in the book of Shemot, in the book of Exodus, chapter 2, verses 1 through 3. It says, a man from the house of Levi went and took a daughter of Levi. This man from the house of Levi is, we know him as Amram. He is Moshe's father, also the father to Miriam, and also the father to Aaron. And he hears, so he and Yocheved have two children, and he hears that all male babies are going to have to be thrown into the Nile, and so he divorces his wife so that she's not going to have any more children to subject to this terrible decree. And because Amram was a leader in his own right, all the other Israelite men divorced or separated from their wives as well. So no more babies are being. So the Talmud says that Miriam, who has a mouth on her, who wasn't afraid to speak to Paro, and now she's going to tell her father why this is a terrible idea. And she gives him three reasons. She says, your decree is even harsher than Paro's, because Paro issued a decree only against boys, but in separating married couples and not having any more children be born to them, also no more females can be born. And also Paro decreed concerning this world. What you've decreed concerns the world to come, because even a baby who is born in this world and drowns, his soul goes to the next world, right? He has some olam haba, some life in the world to come. But unborn children can't do that. And the third thing she says to him is, in any case, Paro is wicked and you're righteous. So because he's wicked, there's some doubt whether his decree is going to be fulfilled. But in your case, since you're righteous, people are going to listen to you, and husbands and wives are going to separate, and no more children are going to be born. So this is the argument that little Miriam gives to her father. And why one of the reasons that it says a man went from the house of Levi means that at that point he had been separated from Yocheved because of this decree of Paro, and he remarried her because his daughter convinced him that that was a bad move. Okay, and so um, the tradition is that after they are reunited, that Yocheved conceives Moshe. There's a very interesting thing about Yocheved, that she herself was conceived on the journey to Egypt. So you remember that Joseph was in Egypt, and he called all of his brothers and their extended families and his father to come and join him in Egypt. This is now, we're going back to before slavery starts. And so Yocheved, her mother, was pregnant during that journey from Israel to Egypt, and she's born just as the caravan was arriving in Egypt. What's the spiritual lesson for this? Yocheved is ultimately going to give birth to the Redeemer of the Jewish people, or in this point, the Israelites. She herself is born before the extended family, comes into Egypt. Okay. And so there's an idea in Judaism that when God has I'm trying to think, he wants to visit some difficulty on us, that he prepares the solution before he I'm trying to, I don't know how to say this in English because he prepares the cure before the disease. That's a way that I've heard it said in English. Okay. So what is the disease? In this case, the disease is slavery. And the cure for the disease is Moses, because he is going to redeem the nation from slavery, right? So before slavery begins, Yocheved, who's going to give birth to Moses, who's going to redeem the Israelites, is already born. Here's another really fascinating thing that I bet you never heard. When Amram remarries Yocheved after the period of separation, she was transformed to become physically like a young woman, but she was actually 130 years old. Because she was born when they came to Egypt, and they were there for, there's a whole calculation, but at that point the rabbis say she was 130 years old. Now, what's remarkable about this? What other story does this remind you of? Somebody? Right, exactly. And how old was Sarah when she gave birth? Do you know?
99.
And
Abraham was
90.
90. Abraham was 99. Sarah was 90. Okay. And the Torah makes a big deal of the fact that how this 90-year-old woman is giving birth, right? But it doesn't say anything about Yocheved, who's 40. Did I do that right? 40 years older even than Sarah. Why is that? Because the Torah records the miracle of Sarah giving birth at 90 because it was preceded by a prophecy. You remember the angels disguised as men come and visit, and they say, you're going to have a child, and she laughs. I'm talking about the Sarah and Abraham story. And she laughs, but there is no, so an angel predicts that Sarah's going to have a baby in her advanced age, but there is no prophecy about this. And so the Torah itself doesn't even mention it. We have to go into the rabbinic sources to see that she's 130 years old when she gives birth to him. There's an interesting sidebar about the life of Yocheved, and that is that according to one opinion, from the time Amram and Yocheved separated from each other was about 3 years. And in the interim, she married someone else and gave birth to 2 other sons whose names you might know if you're super familiar with the 5 books of Moses, and that is Eldad and Medad. They are mentioned in the book of Bamidbar, which is the book of Numbers, chapter 11, verse 26, that they were prophesying in the camp. It's one opinion. I find it interesting. But in any case, she now is 130 years old. She's going to give birth to Moses. And in the verse, I think it's verse 2, it says that the woman conceived and gave birth to a son. She saw that he was good and she hid him for 3 months. Okay. What does it mean she saw that he was good? One opinion, according to the Talmud, is that the entire house or tent or whatever they lived in was filled with light when he was born. The birth of Moses was not typical. There's another opinion that he was born premature. He was born at 6 months gestation. And Yocheved wasn't sure if he was viable. Okay, so I don't know what that, like today we have neonatologists and incubators and all that kind of stuff. But back then, a baby born at 3 months early maybe isn't so viable. But Yocheved looked at him and she saw that he had nails and he had hair, which are signs of viability. So now she's going to attempt to hide him. And this is the second time that that we see that his life is saved. Okay. The Jewish sources say a lot of positive things. Some of them are kind of hard to believe, but that he was handsome, that he was sturdy, that he was robust, even more than most full-term infants, and that that he was able to speak on the first day that he was born. So this is, some people say also that he was born circumcised. So this is all indications to the family that this is a very special little baby. This is not your typical baby who's going to someday grow up to be somebody great, but the signs were all there at his birth. And Miriam gives him the name Tov, which you know means good. a related word is tuvia. That's another name that refers to goodness. Moses actually has a lot of names in our tradition, but there's a very interesting reason why we don't call him any of those names. We call him Moshe, Moses, which I will get to in a moment. Okay. So Yocheved clearly sees some unique quality in this baby that she believes foreshadows this miracle that he's going to someday perform, and save them. And so she needs to hide him. She's able to hide him because she gave birth 3 months early. So for 3 months, the Egyptians are not expecting her to deliver for 3 months. So she kind of has like a get out of jail free card, or stay out of the Nile free for 3 months, because they're not looking for him um, for 3 months. But at some point, and now in verse 3, she can't hide him anymore. So what does she do? She takes a wicker basket. This is like probably one of the most famous Bible images that even like little kids study. She takes a wicker basket. She smears it with clay on the inside and pitch on the outside, and puts the child in it, and puts the basket among the reeds at the bank of the river Nile. So she's looking for another way to save him because she can't hide him anymore. And so she constructs this basket, and when she sets it in the Nile, she has Miriam, who's still a little girl, kind of watching from the distance so people don't recognize her, but she can then go back and tell her mother what happened in this situation. The tradition is that the outside of the basket was left rough, so it just looked like a bunch of reeds like floating in the river. But there were steps that Yocheved took in order to make the oh wow. Okay, I'm just looking at the time. To make Moshe safe in the basket. And Yocheved places the basket in the marsh, and she turns away because she does not want to witness the potential death of this child, who's not just a child, because, and you can understand that any mother, but what is invested in this child is a belief that this child is going to redeem all of the Israelites from this terrible life that they have in Egypt. Okay. She knows that the Egyptian astrologers said that the Redeemer would meet his end through water. And so by placing him in the Nile, she hopes to confuse them, because remember, their predictions are not a precise science. And to think that the Redeemer had already met his end, and that they wouldn't search anymore for him, and that they would rescind the decree to drown the babies. And that is actually what happens. But what happens to Moshe? So now chapter 2, verses 5 through 10. Now in comes another woman who's critically important in saving Moses, and that is Paro's daughter. Our tradition records her name as Batya, and I'll talk about that when I get to that. But right now, the text itself just refers to her as Paro's daughter, Pharaoh's daughter. She goes down to the river to bathe, and she is accompanied by her maidservants. And she sees that this is not just a random clump of reeds. She sees that this is a basket. And so the text says that she sent her maidservant to go fetch it. So again, Yocheved's idea was to make the basket look like it was just this random bunch of reeds, but Paro's daughter was actually in the water, and she could see a little bit better, and she could see that there's something going on here. What does it mean that she went down to the river to bathe? Some say, to her credit, that she went down there. She lived in the house of Paro. She lived in a culture of idol worship. And some say that she was immersing in the water as a process of separating herself from idol worship, something somewhat akin to the mikveh in a process of conversion that would happen even today. Because Paro and the Egyptians worshipped the Nile as a god. And the daughter of Paro realized that was ridiculous. And she was going there to bathe. Okay. And so she sees this, and she sends her maid to go get this basket. And her maidservants say to her, I'm paraphrasing, are you crazy? Like your father, your own father made this rule. And even if the general population isn't going to adhere to it, certainly the members of his household have to listen to this. And you're about to transgress your father's decree by saving this baby who's supposed to drown in the Nile. At that point, according to the Talmud, the angel Gabriel comes and kills them, the maidservants who spoke out. Now, there's a tradition that they saved one because it wouldn't be right for her to be by herself, to be left unattended. But in here's another thing where you will not see this in the English, but you need the Hebrew, where it says she sent her maidservant and she took it. The word here is amma. An amma can be a maid, but it can also mean an arm. And so one opinion is that this remaining maidservant went to get the basket. That would be like literally. But there's another opinion that the arm of Pharaoh's daughter became lengthened. She stretched out her arm and like magic, like I always imagine the Pinocchio's nose, right? Like that her arm stretched out, became lengthened so that she didn't have to move from the place she was in, but she was able to, by reaching out, she was able to reach the basket. And as soon as she opens the basket, she knows exactly what she's dealing with. Okay. She opens it. This is verse 6. She opened it and saw him, the child, and behold, a youth was crying. She took pity on him and said, this is one of the Hebrew boys. Now, she opened it and saw him, the child. She saw what she expected to see. That's one understanding. She figured that this basket has been placed in the Nile by one of the Hebrews with the hope of saving a newborn child. And she decides she's going to save this child that's within this basket. If the text would have read, she opened it and saw a child, that would have meant that she was surprised to see a child. But it says she opened it and saw him, the child, the one she was expecting to see. There's another opinion that she opened it and saw him means she saw something godly, him, like capital H. She saw the presence of God was somehow protecting, accompanying, however you understand this, that she was able to perceive some kind of light, something special that was accompanying this child to make him seem more important and more special than any other Hebrew boy that she might happen to randomly find floating in the Nile. And she takes pity on him, and she makes a decision that she's going to raise him. Okay. What she has found is a 3-month-old child and not a newborn, because remember, Yocheved had hid him for 3 months. So she understands that he must have been hidden for 3 months, um, and she is going to take care of him. Okay. So in verse 7, his sister, meaning Miriam, who has been watching what's going on, says to the daughter of Paro, should I go and summon a wet nurse from the Hebrew women who will nurse the boy for you? Now, why would she say that? Wouldn't it make sense? Okay, obviously, the daughter of Paro has not just given birth and her breasts are not generating the milk that this infant needs, but wouldn't it have made sense for him to be nursed by an Egyptian woman, right? So the tradition is they tried to get him to nurse from an Egyptian woman, but he refused. And the number one is the Egyptian diet wasn't kosher. Now we're talking about a baby here, okay, who's 3 months old. Whether he was full term or he was premature, this is an infant, and he has the spiritual sensitivity, just to give you like more of a sense of the greatness of Moshe, that he's not going to drink milk from a woman who's eating foods that are forbidden. Now, obviously, the Torah hasn't been given yet. Kosher food's not really a thing yet. But there's also a tradition that Moses is going to grow up and he's going to be a person who speaks with God face to face. And that either God said that a mouth is going to speak with me face to face should not nurse from what is unclean. Now, again, the Torah hasn't been given yet. But there is a tradition that the patriarchs, the matriarchs, all of the big names that they were able to keep some aspects of the Torah. There was some oral tradition. And they don't want at some point in time some Egyptian woman to say, this man that speaks with God, I nursed him at my breast. You see how that like wouldn't play so well. Okay. So Miriam says, let me get you a nurse, a wet nurse from the Hebrew women. And she goes to do that. And where does she go? Of course. So Paro's daughter agrees. She says, take this baby, nurse, get him a nurse, and I'll pay for it. And then you can return the baby when he's weaned. And this is Yocheved's reward for disobeying Paro in the first place and allowing newborn boys to live, and rewarded the same day that she places her son in the river, he's restored to her. Not only is he restored to her for the duration of the time that he's going to nurse until he's about 3 years old, but now she's getting paid for it. So she can not only keep him out in the open and nurse him out in the open, but she's getting paid for it. Okay, so rather than drowning in the Nile, he is saved again by the daughter of Paro. So now this is the third time. And when Moshe is 3 years old, this is verse 10, the boy grows up and they bring him back to the daughter of Paro, and she adopts him as a son, and she gives him the name Moses, which is somehow related to the Egyptian concept of drawing out of the water. And that's the name we know him by. Why? Because that is a reward for her. Look at the risk that she took. Okay. She takes this Hebrew baby and she spends money for 3 years to make sure that he's taken care of. She brings him into the very house because she lives in the palace of Paro. Paro's no friend of the people that he was born to. She raises him as her own son in defiance of the politics and her father's position. Even it says that Paro himself did not know that this was an Israelite child, and he would constantly play with him, which is an indication that when he wants to, that God can make miracles right out in the open, because this child grows up in the house of Paro, and they are eventually going to become enemies, or they're going to be contenders. Okay. There's a tradition, a Jewish tradition, that she was rewarded in probably one of the best ways that God can reward a person, and that is that she was allowed to enter Gan Eden or paradise or the next world while she was alive. And also the idea that we call him Moses to this day is also a reward, because remember I told you he had many names, and this was the name that we know him by because she saved his life. And so the rabbis teach that from here we learn how great is the reward for performing kindness. Exactly, that even though he's known by other names in the Torah, I mean, he's known by other names in Jewish tradition, but the name that she gave him is the name that stuck. Now, in the book of Chronicles, Divrei Hayamim, the first book of Chronicles, chapter 4, verse 18, she is referred to as Batya. This is the first time, all through Shemot, all through the book of Exodus, she's just called the daughter of Paro. Batya is, it literally means Bat, daughter, Yah, God, daughter of God. It's like God named her that. God gave her that name because he said, Moses was not your son, but you took him on and you called him your son. You are not my daughter, meaning she wasn't Jewish, but I'm going to call you my daughter. So he names her Batya. And you can find that First Chronicles chapter 4, verse 18. Okay. I told you that one of the rewards from Miriam, oh dear, okay. One of the rewards from Miriam was that she marries Caleb, and she is an ancestor of the house of David. At some point in the future, Miriam dies and Caleb marries Batya, according to our tradition, because at that point, she's aligned with God, she's aligned with Torah, she's aligned with the Israelites and so forth. She rebelled against the idolatry of her father's house, and Kalev rebelled against the council of the spies. If you remember the story, he was one of the two, along with Yoshua, along with Joshua, who did not buy into the what the spies said, and those two said, no, God sent us to this land, we can do it, we can do it. Now it is now an hour, and I know I had a little technical difficulty, so I want to just get your read on this, because we've spoken about the Hebrew midwives, his mother, his sister, his adoptive mother, and the last piece of this is Tzipporah, who is the woman he eventually marries, and how she saves his life not once but twice. So my question to you is, do you want me to do this now, or do you want me to save this? We're not meeting next week because next week is Shavuos. Do you want me to save this for the next time, or do you want me to continue now?
Okay.
Continue? Okay, I'll try to do this really fast. This is so fascinating. Batya and Sipporah, according to a midrash, were twin orphans. Paro adopts Batya. She's not even his biological daughter, according to this tradition. And Sipporah, who becomes the wife of Moses, is adopted by Yitro, who I think you called Jethro. Okay. Because these two girls, well, they're eventually women, but these two women who are twins are both critically important in the life of Moses. Okay. So I'm just very briefly, the Yitro, who's called the minister of Midian, he has 7 daughters. There's no boys in this family. The daughters go to the well to water their father's sheep, and that's where they run into Moses, who is running away from Egypt because he has just killed an Egyptian. And he's able to help them, so they end up going home extra early, and the father says, what are you doing home so early? You had a job to do. And they replied that an Egyptian man saved us from the shepherds and drew water for us, and he watered the sheep. Okay, they referred to Moses as an Egyptian man because he still wore Egyptian clothing, because he was on the run, according to one opinion, only recently having fled from the palace of Paro. Okay, and in Shemot, in Exodus chapter 2, verse 21, Moses decides he wants to live with this family. He wants to take shelter with them. And Yitro, the father of the family, gives his daughter Tzipporah to Moshe. That's the text. Now, there's a really interesting midrash that is different than what I just said, that Moses is telling Yitro his life story. How did he come to be there? Who is he? Where does he come from? Blah, blah, blah. He's not yet being called to the burning bush. He's not yet the leader. Right now, he's just on the run. And he tells a story of how he spent 40 years in Ethiopia. He ran away from Paro. He spent 40 years in Ethiopia, and he was the king of Ethiopia. This is one opinion. And he got deposed, and he had to leave Ethiopia, and now he's again looking for a place to be. Now Yitro has no idea at this point who this guy is, and he assumes that he must have done something terrible if he was the king of Kush of Ethiopia, to be deposed from the throne and to have to be on the run. And so he throws him in prison, and he orders that he not be given any food or water. Now, we know that Moses doesn't die in this prison, despite the fact that Yitro has said to him, no food or no water. Why is that? Because Tzipporah has pity on him, and for 10 years, she brings him food and water. And one day, 10 years later, she goes to her father and she says, hey, you remember that guy a long time ago that you put in prison? And have you ever looked into it, whatever happened to him? And Yitro, of course, said, what are you talking about? He's obviously dead. He's been in this dungeon for 10 years without food and water. There's no way he could have survived. And Tzipporah says, well, you never know. I've heard that the God of the Hebrews has great powers and does great miracles. And maybe maybe something happened and you should go look. So Yitro sends men to examine the cell where he threw Moshe 10 years ago. He's healthy, he's alive, he's, according to the tradition, he's praying. They release him from prison, they give him new clothes, and they bring him to Yitro. Now, this sounds very much like another story of
Joseph.
Joseph, exactly. Total parallel. If you look in Bereshit, the book of Genesis, chapter 41, you'll see like it's almost a direct overlay. Okay. So now Moses is back in good standing, and Zipporah has proven herself to be God-fearing, and she is actually compared positively to the matriarchs. So again, she saved his life again, because he would have died in that prison without food or water. Now, how does it happen that this prisoner, that Yitro agrees to give one of his daughters to this prisoner? Okay, even though he's alive, it's not necessarily it. I don't know. Yitro doesn't know what to think, but here's what happens. There's a tradition in Torah that's, I believe it's 10 things were created on Friday evening during the twilight of creation. And one of those things is the staff of Moses. Adam received it when he was in the Garden of Eden, and he gave it, it's a whole transmission. He gave it to Enoch. Enoch gave it to one of Noah's sons. One of Noah's sons gave it to Abraham. Abraham gave it to Isaac, to Jacob, to Joseph. It goes to Paro. Yitro, who was originally part of the contingency serving Paro, took it when he left Egypt. And Yitro's a bit of a magician himself, and he buries it in the middle of his garden in such a way that nobody can uproot it. Does this sound familiar to you? There's a secular tradition about this magical sword that nobody, I don't remember the name of it, but no, if somebody can withdraw this sword from the ground, they're granted something. I don't remember. Anyway, Yitro makes a promise that any man who can pull this staff out of the ground can have his wife Tzipporah, who was apparently the most beautiful daughter of all of his daughters, as a wife. And many of the strong men of Midian tried, and they all failed. So one day Moshe is walking through the garden. He notices the staff, and he recognizes that it has some Hebrew written on it. And what's written on it is one of God's mystical names. And he comes closer to take a closer look at it. And he takes a hold of it, and he's immediately able to pull it out of the ground, according to our tradition. He brings the staff to Yitro, and he recognizes now Moshe is not some ordinary guy. He doesn't necessarily know that Tzipporah was sustaining him and keeping him alive, but he does understand that this is a special man. And so he gives Tzipporah in marriage. They get married, they have a baby. Okay, they have a son. This is the first son. He is named Gershom, which means I have been a stranger in a foreign land. And it's interesting to note that Zipporah is one of 7 daughters. There's no men in the family for this whole generation. Moses accepts the job of, he's now going to be tending Yisro's sheep. And so she gives birth to Gershom. And then in the intervening chapters and verses, there's the whole thing about being called, God calling him to the burning bush. And now it's time to go back to Egypt and try to have a conversation with Pharaoh to get the Israelites out. Okay. And it says in chapter 4, verse 20, that Moses took his wife and sons and mounted them on the donkey and returned to the land of Egypt. Why does it say sons? We know about Gershom, because 8 days before, Tzipporah gives birth to another son. And this is one of the most bizarre stories in all of Tanakh, in my opinion, that they are now the newborn son, the toddler son, Moses and Tzipporah are headed back to Egypt. And on the way, they stop in lodging. Now, this is chapter 4, verse 24, that God encountered him, meaning Moses, and sought to kill him. What is this all about? Moses is about to leave for Egypt, according to God's command, and he doesn't know what to do about circumcising his newborn son. Circumcision, you remember, I'll tell you, circumcision happens on the 8th day, okay? And it requires a few days of recuperation. So Moses doesn't know what to do. If he waits, to circumcise his son and waits for him to heal, he might miss his opportunity to free all of the Israelite slaves. So he doesn't know what to do. So he decides he's going to leave right away. So he's postponing the circumcision. As soon as they stop at an inn for the night or whatever, according to our tradition, that's when he should have circumcised his son. Circumcision is a hugely important mitzvah in the Torah. And God is angry with him because that's not what he did. And it says that God sought to kill him. The tradition is through an angel. Now, here's the story. God says to Moses, you are on a mission to defeat the mighty Paro, who is uncircumcised. That's one of the ways that the Torah talks about men who are not, or enemies who are lowly, who are not elevated, they're not respectable, that they are uncircumcised beast. You're about to lead my children out of Egypt. How could you have forgotten your own child and allowed him to remain uncircumcised? Okay, the very next verse, what does Tzipporah do? She takes a stone and she circumcises her son. Now, this is the really wild part of the story. She understands through some kind of divine inspiration what needs to be done. How does she know that Moshe is in danger? Because the angel swallows Moshe from the head until his genitals. And seeing this, she realizes that he's being she puts it together that he's being attacked on account of the issue of circumcision. She also realizes that circumcision is this tremendous protection because the angel could not swallow him any further than the point, this is a little graphic, but than the point of his circumcision. And so she takes the initiative, and again, she saves her husband from God's anger, and she circumcises her son right away with the sharp stone, saving his life once again. Okay, I just want to end with this conclusion. I thank you for those of you that were able to stay with us. Moses redeems the Israelites from slavery. He brings the Torah to them and subsequently to all of us at Har Sinai, at Mount Sinai. And it is the wisdom of all of these women that not only save him, but save all of the Israelites and all of the people who will become the Jewish people. And without their willingness to take risks, their bold actions, often at risk of their own lives, it's reasonable to ask, would there even be a Torah today? Would there even be a Jewish people today? And so all of this together, the many times that I've told you over and over again that there's a woman or a girl involved in saving Moshe's life and nurturing him for him to be who he is. We talk a whole lot about Moses and his central role. And I wanted you to have a fuller picture of the women that contributed to that. So there you go. That is what I prepared for us today. I'm sorry we went way over, and I apologize, but I thank you for your patience. And so again, no class next week because of Shavuot, and then I think I'll get back to you on the group. I think we meet again. I'm happy to let you all go, but does anybody have any comments or questions, anything you want to say or add or ask before I end the meeting? Okay, fine. So thank you again for being with me. I hope that you enjoyed that little walk through the life of Moses and the women in his life. There's also, by the way, I will share this with you as well. There's a whole book on this topic called Moses's Women. A lot of what we talked about and much more is in this book, and I will, as usual, share a link for that. And I thank you very much, and I look forward to seeing you, God willing, in 2 weeks. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Rebecca.
Thanks, Rivka.